The Dark Ages are known to be one of the most brutal times in human history. A time where life was cheap, death was common, diseases were rampant, societal norms were questionable, and the world was just a straight-up rough place to live in. Or is it? Because it turns out the Dark Ages weren't actually that dark. In fact, the Dark Ages were full of invention, discovery, art, culture, everything we typically associate with the light and not the dark. For example, the German historian Leopold von Ranke referred to the time period as the Viekener Ikmacht, or the Eternal Night. However, as the centuries went on, the term Dark Ages became the accepted term to describe this time period. Sure, it didn't reach the heights of the classical era, but a lot of incredible things happened during the Dark Ages. Well, turns out that the answer depends on who you ask. Probably. Should we stop saying it was a time of massive death and destruction? Absolutely. But calling it a dark time in human history? I think that's fair game. And hey, at least it's not as bad as calling it the worst time in human history, which is something that I absolutely cannot stand. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and like the video if you enjoyed. If you want to learn more about the Middle Ages, I highly recommend checking out the series in the description below. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Historians tend to blame the term Dark Ages on 19th century French historians, who wanted to put emphasis on the transition from the classical era to the Renaissance. Meanwhile, art historians claim the term is a result of the Enlightenment's obsession with ancient Greece and Rome. Writers and philosophers claim it's because the Dark Ages never reached the heights of the Renaissance, and so on and so forth. But honestly, it's probably a combination of all of these factors and more. Ultimately, it comes down to perspective. The Dark Ages were called the Dark Ages because people living during the Renaissance thought it was dark. And the term stuck, even though it wasn't technically accurate. We continue to use it today, even though we know better. Take the printing press, for example. While Gutenberg's printing press is often seen as the start of the Renaissance, it actually came after it. Gutenberg completed his press in about 1440, right at the tail end of the Dark Ages. The Renaissance began in Italy in the late 13th century and lasted till the 16th century. Therefore, the printing press was invented during the Dark Ages, but it didn't cause the Renaissance. In fact, it helped spread Renaissance ideas. There were plenty of other inventions created during the Dark Ages, too. To name a few, the mechanical clock, the astrolabe, eyeglasses, magnetic compass, gunpowder, cannons, banks, accounting ledgers, universities, the three-field crop rotation system, the heavy plow, and maybe even the very first computer. Despite what popular culture believes, the Dark Ages were also a time of incredible art, architecture, literature, and philosophy. Again, sure, it didn't reach the heights of Greece or Rome, but that doesn't mean it was bad. Some of the most iconic buildings ever built were constructed during the Dark Ages, including the Hagia Sophia Aachen Cathedral, in the first versions of the Tower of London and the Kremlin, and some of the greatest works of literature were written during the Dark Ages as well, like Beowulf, the Song of Roland, and many others. Not to mention, some of the most influential philosophical ideas were conceived during the Dark Ages, too. Think of John Scotus, Erigena, one of the most important figures in medieval philosophy. He lived during the Dark Ages, as did Al-Kindi, one of the founding fathers of Islamic philosophy. And even non-French historians started using it. By the 20th century, it had become commonplace in popular culture, too. People began using the term Dark Ages to describe any period of great social or cultural decline. In 1967, the band Black Sabbath released the song Iron Man, which included the lyrics, "And as I grew older, I became so much more aware of all the pain that had been caused through all the Dark Ages." Now no one knows exactly how many people were killed in the Dark Ages. Estimates vary widely depending on the source, and when the Dark Ages began and ended. But according to the World Population Review, the estimated world population in the year 1000 AD was around 295 million people, with a range of roughly 275 to 325 million. By 1400, however, the estimated world population was around 350 million people, with a range of roughly 325 to 400 million. So despite the widespread belief that the Dark Ages was a time of plague, famine, and war that wiped out huge portions of the population, it turns out the total number of deaths is negligible compared to the overall population. In fact, If we were to take the low estimate of 275 million people alive in the year 1000 and subtract the high estimate of 325 million people alive in the year 1400, we would end up with a grand total of negative 50 million people, which doesn't seem very realistic. So unless people were spontaneously combusting in the 14th century, it's safe to say that the Dark Ages were not defined by its death toll. So what exactly are the Dark Ages, and why aren't they as dark as everyone thinks? Specifically from the 5th to about the 10th century, roughly the time period from the fall of Rome to the beginning of the Viking Age, even then. This isn't a completely accurate description of life in early medieval Europe. After all, we tend to think of the Dark Ages as a time of absolute darkness, but it was actually fairly well lit. Cities might have been dimmer than modern cities, but they were still illuminated by the sun and by candles and oil lamps. Rural areas were darker, yes, but they were still light enough for most activities. Plus, people weren't walking around in complete darkness. Most people had night blindness and couldn't see well in the dark. Also, contrary to popular opinion, literacy rates weren't that low. Sure, only about 15% of Europeans could read and write in the year 800, but that was about the same as China and India in the same time period and much higher than ancient Rome, which had a literacy rate of only about 10%. Welcome back to the channel. It's me and this is the channel. If this is your first time here, subscribe for more videos about medieval history and everything in between. Today we're talking about the Dark Ages. But before we do that, I have an announcement to make. My book, Medieval Myths and Realities, a comprehensive guide to the Middle Ages, is now available for pre-order. For those of you who don't know, I've been working on this book for the last 2 years of my life, and it's finally ready to go. This book will cover 100 myths about the Middle Ages, explaining whether they're true or false. And along the way, share plenty of crazy facts and stories from medieval history. If you want to help support me while also getting a really cool book, then head on over to the website to grab yourself a copy today. But now let's get back to the video. Now let's talk about the Dark Ages. As much as I love the Middle Ages, even I can admit that it was a pretty dark time to live. Life was hard, death was everywhere, and things were generally just pretty terrible. So how did we come up with the term Dark Ages to describe such a horrible period of human history? Well, it turns out the Dark Ages weren't actually called the Dark Ages at all, at least not by people living in the time period. The term Dark Ages didn't appear until about 1839, when the historian Jules Michelet published his book, The History of France. In it, he describes this time period between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance as the Ages Obscures or the Dark Ages. Michelet wasn't the first person to refer to this time period as dark. Similar phrases like that barbarous age had been used since the Renaissance. But Michelet was the first to use the term systematically and academically. He and other 19th century historians believed that the Middle Ages were characterized by ignorance, barbarity, superstition, and most of all, darkness. They saw the Middle Ages as a time of societal decline, a deviation from the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome, and a prelude to the glorious era of the Renaissance. But there's one thing all these historians had in common. They were French. Historians in other countries didn't necessarily agree. So why exactly were the Dark Ages so dark, aside from being such a broad generalization that even historians disagree on what it means? The idea that the Dark Ages were dark comes from their view of early medieval Europe. But perhaps the biggest misconception about the Dark Ages is that it was a time of no progress. As you can see, the Dark Ages weren't that dark after all. So what exactly is so dark about the Dark Ages? So should we stop saying the Dark Ages were a time of no progress and ignorance?